At exactly 7:42 p.m., a barefoot little girl walked onto a stage she was never supposed to be near, grabbed a microphone in front of 500 wealthy guests, and said 6 words that destroyed a billionaire's wedding before it even began. The bride dropped her champagne glass. The groom turned pale. And somewhere in the back of the room, a terrified housekeeper realized the secret she had spent months trying to protect was about to explode in front of everyone. What happened next was so shocking that security cameras were later reviewed frame by frame, because nobody could understand how a 4-year-old child knew something that only 3 adults on Earth were supposed to know. By the end of that night, a wedding worth $3 million was canceled. One woman disappeared from the city, and a lonely billionaire would discover that the person who truly saved his life wasn't a lawyer, a friend, or a business partner. It was a little girl holding a stuffed rabbit. And the 6 words she spoke that night changed everything. Stay with me, because this story starts with a maid nobody noticed, a child nobody listened to, and a secret powerful people would have done anything to keep buried. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city and state in the comments. I read every single one, and I am always amazed at how far this community reaches. Because the kind of story I am about to tell you doesn't belong to one place. It belongs to anyone who has ever been invisible in a room full of people and found out the hard way that invisible doesn't mean powerless. Her name was Teresa, 31 years old, single mother, housekeeper, the kind of woman who moves through the world so quietly that most people forget she was ever there at all. She had grown up in a small town outside of Nashville, Tennessee, the youngest of 4 children raised by a mother who cleaned houses for a living and a father who had left so long ago that Teresa barely remembered what direction the door had swung when he walked out of it. She had inherited her mother's work ethic, her mother's hands, and her mother's understanding that the world was divided into people who were served and people who served, and that crossing from one side to the other required either extraordinary luck or extraordinary sacrifice. Teresa had neither. What she had was a 4-year-old daughter named Daisy, a battered silver sedan with a check engine light that had been on for 8 months, and a job that paid her $12 above minimum wage at one of the most spectacular private estates in all of Asheville, North Carolina. The Caldwell estate sat on 42 acres on the eastern ridge above the city. The main house had 11 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, a wine cellar that had been written about in 3 separate lifestyle publications, and a terrace that overlooked the Blue Ridge Mountains in a way that made grown adults go silent the first time they saw it. The man who owned all of it was named Preston Caldwell, 53 years old, real estate development titan. Self-made in the way that men who inherit significant advantages like to describe themselves when they want to emphasize how hard they worked. He had built his father's regional property company into a national operation worth somewhere north of $2 billion, and he had done it with the kind of cold, precise intelligence that makes people respect you from a distance, while keeping them from ever getting close enough to actually like you. Preston Caldwell had been alone for a long time. His first marriage had ended 11 years earlier. No children from that union, no public explanation for the divorce, just a quiet legal separation that had been handled with the same efficiency he applied to everything else in his life. In the years since, he had dated occasionally, always women who appeared in the right social circles, always relationships that seemed more like strategic partnerships than anything rooted in genuine feeling. His staff had watched all of it with the particular attentiveness of people who spend their working lives inside the private world of someone else's existence. And what his staff had concluded, collectively and without much discussion, was that Preston Caldwell was one of the loneliest men any of them had ever encountered. Teresa had come to work at the estate 8 months before the night everything fell apart. She had come because the hourly rate was better than anything else she could find that would let her keep Daisy close during the days, and because the estate had a small staff cottage out back where she and Daisy could live on site, which meant one less rent payment in a budget that had no room for anything extra. She had arrived with 2 suitcases, a box of Daisy's books, and a stuffed rabbit named Button that Daisy had owned since she was 11 months old and treated with the reverence usually reserved for religious objects. Teresa had arrived quiet, careful, and determined to do her job well and stay out of the way of everything else. For the first 3 months, that was exactly what she did. Daisy was the complication, not because Daisy was difficult. She was, in fact, one of the easiest children Teresa had ever known, which she recognized was a deeply biased assessment coming from Daisy's own mother, but which the other staff members had independently confirmed on multiple occasions. Daisy was curious, gentle, and possessed of a quality that is both the greatest gift and the greatest liability a small child can have. She paid attention. She noticed everything. She remembered everything she noticed. And she had not yet learned the adult habit of deciding that some things you notice are better left unacknowledged. Preston Caldwell had encountered Daisy for the first time on a Saturday morning in October, approximately 6 weeks after Teresa started. Daisy had wandered into the kitchen while Teresa was cleaning the adjoining pantry and Preston had come in for coffee and found a 4-year-old sitting on the floor with Button, conducting what appeared to be a very serious tea party involving 3 upside-down measuring cups and a salt shaker she had recruited as a guest. Preston had stood in the doorway for a moment. He was not a man who spent much time around children. He did not know the vocabulary for it, but something about the absolute commitment Daisy brought to the measuring cup tea party had arrested him completely. He had asked her what she was doing. She had told him, in extensive detail, about the tea party and its attendees, including the salt shaker's name, which was Gerald, and Gerald's personality, which was apparently shy but well-meaning. Preston had listened to the entire thing. Then he had poured his coffee and gone back to his office. But that evening, Teresa had noticed that someone had left a small box of sugar cookies on the kitchen counter with a post-it note that said simply, "For Gerald and his friends." There was no signature, but Teresa knew the handwriting. She had seen it on household correspondence. It was Preston's. That was the beginning of something none of them had planned for or expected. Preston Caldwell, in the months that followed, had a way of finding reasons to be in whatever room Daisy was in. Not intrusively, not inappropriately. He would appear in the garden when Daisy was helping Carlos the groundskeeper identify butterflies, crouch down to her level, and ask which one was her favorite. He would stop in the doorway of the kitchen when Daisy was helping Teresa fold dish towels into shapes she had invented and insisted were actual animals, and stand there just long enough to hear what she was calling them. He never stayed long. He never said much, but he kept coming back. And Daisy, who was 4 years old and had no filter between what she felt and what she said, had at some point decided that Preston Caldwell was one of her favorite people in the world and had begun telling him so directly, and without any self-consciousness whatsoever every time she saw him. Teresa watched all of this with the careful attention of a woman who understood exactly how precarious her situation was. She was not naive. She was not sentimental about the boundaries between employer and staff. She had no illusions about what her position meant or how quickly it could be taken away. But she also could not have stopped Daisy from liking Preston any more than she could have stopped the sun from coming up. And if she was being honest with herself in the quiet hours after Daisy was asleep, she had started to understand, in ways she did not let herself think about directly, why Daisy felt the way she felt about him. Because Preston Caldwell, when he was not being the Titan, when he was not in a meeting or on a call or running the vast machinery of his professional life, had a quality that his public persona completely obscured. He was kind, not performatively, not as a strategy, just quietly, practically kind in the way of someone who had learned kindness the hard way and never stopped practicing it. Then Nadia arrived, and everything changed. Nadia Vance was 36 years old and beautiful in the way that certain women are beautiful when they have made it a project. She had auburn hair, green eyes, and the particular radiance of someone who has calculated exactly how much of their natural appearance to cultivate and exactly how much to augment, and has executed that calculation flawlessly. She moved through the world as though it had been arranged for her convenience, which, for much of her adult life, it had been. She had a background in wealth management, a network of social connections that spanned 3 cities, and an ex-husband in Boston who had, by all available accounts, been extremely generous in the divorce settlement. She had met Preston at a charity gala in Charlotte 5 months before Teresa started working at the estate. Within 3 months they were exclusive. Within 5, she had a key to the Caldwell estate's front door. And within 7, Preston Caldwell had proposed with a ring that was later appraised at $400,000 and announced an engagement party and wedding that would be the social event of the year in Asheville, a $3 million celebration scheduled for the second Saturday in April, 3 months away. The staff had learned about the engagement from Thomas, the estate's household manager, who had delivered the news with the careful neutrality of a man who had opinions he was professionally obligated not to share. Teresa had nodded and said she was happy for Mr. Caldwell. She had gone back to her room that night, put Daisy to bed, and sat in the chair by the window for a long time. She told herself her feelings about it were irrelevant. She told herself that whatever she thought she had observed between herself and Preston over those months was nothing more than proximity and projection, the inevitable emotional distortion of spending 8 months inside someone's private world. She told herself to do her job and stay in her lane. She was good at telling herself things. She had a lot of practice. What she could not tell herself out of existence was what she had already seen, what she had already, accidentally and irreversibly, come to know. It had happened 6 weeks before the engagement announcement, a Thursday afternoon in late November. Nadia had been at the estate for 2 days, which happened occasionally, and Teresa had been cleaning the guest suite adjacent to the East Wing study when she heard Nadia's voice through the shared wall vent. The vent was an old architectural feature that had never been properly sealed, and sound traveled through it with remarkable clarity. Teresa had not been trying to listen. But the conversation she overheard stopped her so completely that she stood motionless in the middle of that room for the entire duration of it. Nadia was on the phone. The man on the other end had a voice Teresa heard clearly through the vent, and what he said first was this. He said, "Nadia, the Caldwell asset inventory is exactly what we thought. If the prenuptial structure holds the way you've described, you're looking at a guaranteed floor of $65 million upon dissolution of the marriage, but only if you hold the position for the minimum term. Are we still aligned on the timeline?" And Nadia's voice came back smooth and unhurried. She said, "We are aligned. Stop calling me on a number that can be traced to this property. I know what I'm doing. I have been doing it for 8 months. The man said something Teresa couldn't fully make out, and then Nadia said, in a voice that had dropped even further but was still entirely audible through the vent, "Preston is exactly what I knew he would be. Lonely, generous, and desperate to believe someone actually wants him. This is the easiest one I've ever run. Just make sure the secondary account is ready before the ceremony." Teresa did not move for a long time after the call ended. Then she went back to cleaning the guest suite because she did not know what else to do with her body. Her mind was another matter entirely. Her mind was loud and fast and extremely afraid. What she had just heard was not a misunderstanding. It was not a private conversation that could be explained with context she did not have. It was the architecture of a deliberate financial scheme, the kind she had read about only in the context of crime stories, the kind where a woman with a strategy marries a man with money for the specific purpose of extracting the maximum possible amount of it before the marriage dissolves. Nadia Vance was not in love with Preston Caldwell. She had never been in love with Preston Caldwell. She had identified him, assessed him, and inserted herself into his life with the precision of someone who had, as she said herself, done this before. And now Teresa knew. which meant Teresa had a problem so large she could barely see the edges of it. Think about what she was holding. She was a housekeeper, a woman with no savings, no legal resources, no social standing in the world that Preston Caldwell occupied. She had a 4-year-old daughter and a job that provided the roof over that daughter's head. If she said what she knew and Nadia denied it, which Nadia absolutely would, Teresa would be dismissed immediately. There would be no reference, no severance, and almost certainly no future employment in any similar position, because Nadia would make sure of that. And if she said nothing, she had to watch a man who had crouched down to listen to a 4-year-old talk about a Tea Party marry a woman who was running a financial con on him with the cool efficiency of someone who had done it more than once. Teresa spent 3 weeks in that particular hell. 3 weeks of keeping her face neutral and her voice steady, and her distance appropriate, while Nadia moved through the Caldwell estate like she already owned it, which she was, in fact, preparing to do. 3 weeks of watching Preston look at Nadia the way only a genuinely lonely man looks at a person he believes has chosen him. 3 weeks of writing nothing down, saying nothing out loud, and telling herself every single night that she would find a way to handle this without destroying everything she and Daisy depended on. She was still trying to figure out how when the wedding arrived. The date was the second Saturday in April. The estate had been transformed in the weeks leading up to it with the specific extravagance of people who have decided that the size of the celebration is evidence of the sincerity of the feeling. 500 guests, a tent structure over the main lawn that cost more than some people's houses, floral arrangements that had been flown in from 3 different states, a catering team of 40 people, a string ensemble, a jazz quartet, a DJ for the later hours. $3 million of preparation for an event that its female principal had been privately planning to eventually dissolve. The cruelty of it was almost architectural. Teresa had been assigned wedding coordination duties in addition to her regular responsibilities. She was managing the flow of guest gifts into a designated receiving area, coordinating with the tent staff on table placement, and handling a dozen other logistical details that had been piled onto her without additional compensation, though this was not the detail she was focused on. She was focused on Daisy. Daisy was in the staff cottage. She was supposed to stay there. Mrs. Henley, the estate's cook, had agreed to check on her every half hour, and Daisy had been given a solemn and loving instruction from her mother to stay inside, watch her show, and not move from the cottage under any circumstances until Teresa came to get her. Daisy had agreed. She had meant it. She had held Button tightly and nodded very seriously and fully intended to honor every word of her promise. What Daisy had not anticipated was that her show would end, and that the music from the wedding tent, which carried across the grounds with the clear, warm specificity of an April evening where the air is exactly the right temperature to carry sound perfectly, would be so beautiful and so close that it seemed almost rude not to go and see where it was coming from. She did not go to the front of the estate. She went around the back, through the garden path she knew because Carlos had walked it with her so many times she could find it with her eyes closed. She followed the lights. She followed the music. She was barefoot because she had taken off her shoes inside and then forgotten them when curiosity overrode everything else the way it does for 4-year-olds who are following something that sounds like magic. She had Button under her arm. The stage was at the front of the tent, elevated 3 steps above the main floor, and it had been set up for the ceremony itself, which had concluded 20 minutes earlier, and was now staged with a single standing microphone for the toast portion of the evening. The master of ceremonies had stepped away briefly. The microphone was live. The 500 guests were in various states of champagne-fueled conversation when the murmur began at the back of the tent, and moved forward in the particular way that murmurs move when something unexpected has appeared. People began noticing. People began going quiet. Because there was a barefoot 4-year-old in a yellow dress, climbing the 3 steps to the stage with a stuffed rabbit under her arm, and the calm certainty of a child who goes where the music is, and does not yet understand that some stages are not for her. Daisy reached the microphone. It was too tall. She stood on her toes. She grabbed it with both hands, button flopping against her wrist. The room had gone almost entirely still. 500 people. Champagne glasses paused midway to mouths. The jazz quartet had stopped playing. And in that silence in front of everyone, Daisy looked out at the crowd with the open, searching gaze of a child looking for someone familiar, and she found the one face she recognized. She found Preston, and she pointed at him. And she said, in her clear, unhesitating, 4-year-old voice, the 6 words that destroyed everything. She said, "Mr. Preston, that lady is lying." The bride dropped her champagne glass. It shattered on the marble floor near the edge of the dance space, and every single person in that tent heard it hit. Preston went pale in the specific way of someone who has just felt the ground shift under them, but has not yet determined in which direction it is moving. Nadia's face, which had been arranged in the particular expression of a bride performing radiance for 500 witnesses, went through something that happened too fast for most people in the room to fully catch. But Teresa caught it. Teresa was at the back of the tent. Teresa had seen Daisy slip away and had been moving toward the stage for 30 seconds already, weaving through guests, heart hammering, understanding with terrible clarity what was happening and powerless to stop it. She caught Nadia's expression in the moment before Nadia rebuilt it, and what she saw there was not shock. It was recognition. Nadia had recognized in a split second that the game was over. She just hadn't decided yet how to play the ending. The murmur that moved through 500 people in those seconds was not the murmur of scandal-seeking entertainment. It was the murmur of something more profound and more uncomfortable than that. It was the sound of 500 people confronting the possibility that they had just witnessed something real, and that none of them knew what to do about it. Preston crouched down from the edge of the stage. He looked at Daisy. His voice when he spoke to her was not the voice of a man addressing an interruption or a crisis. It was the same voice he had always used with her, low and direct and completely present. He said, "Daisy, hey, what do you mean?" Daisy held button a little tighter. She said, "I heard her on the phone. She said mean things about you. She said you don't know." She furrowed her brow the way she did when she was trying to find the exact right words and was frustrated they were not coming fast enough. "She said you think she loves you, but she doesn't. She said it was easy." Preston's face did not collapse the way people might expect a face to collapse under those words. It became very still. The kind of stillness that is not the absence of feeling but the controlled management of too much of it at once. Teresa reached the stage. She stepped forward. She picked Daisy up. She looked at Preston and she said the thing she had been building toward for 3 weeks and had not found the courage to say until this moment made it unavoidable. She said, "Mr. Caldwell, I heard the same thing she heard 6 weeks ago, through the vent in the East guest suite. I should have come to you then. I am so sorry I didn't, but it is true, every word of it." The silence that followed that statement was a different kind of silence than the one that had followed Daisy's words. That silence had been the collective breath-holding of a crowd waiting to understand something. This silence was the collective understanding arriving, all at once. 500 people, the attorneys and the business partners and the society friends and the distant relatives, and the carefully curated social circle of Preston Caldwell's public life, understanding simultaneously that the wedding they had just watched was not what it appeared to be. Nadia moved. She was composed right up to the moment it became clear that composed was no longer a viable position, and then she made the calculation that all people who operate through performance make when the performance collapses. She decided the best available option was to leave. She walked toward the exit at the side of the tent with the controlled pace of someone who is declining to participate in a scene. 2 members of Preston's security team who had been stationed at the entrance moved in response to a barely perceptible nod from Preston's household manager Thomas and intercepted her before she reached the exit. She did not run. She was too controlled for running, but she stopped, and in stopping she confirmed everything. Preston asked all 500 guests to please enjoy the evening's hospitality. His voice was steady. His face was composed. He was, among other things, a man who had spent 30 years managing difficult situations in front of audiences, and whatever he was feeling in that moment, he was not going to perform it for 500 witnesses. He stepped away from the tent with Thomas and his personal attorney. He did not look back at Nadia. He did not need to. The phone that Nadia had used for those calls was reviewed that night. The secondary account she had referenced was identified. The man she had been speaking to, a financial consultant named Roger who operated in a legal gray area that his clients found useful, was not difficult to find because he was not expecting to need to be. There had been at least 3 prior marriages of similar design, 3 other men in 3 other cities, each of whom had signed prenuptial agreements that had contained, in one version or another, terms that favored Nadia significantly upon dissolution. 2 of those men had divorced her within 4 years. One was still married, though his attorney was, as of the following week, being contacted. It was not a small operation. It was a practiced one. Nadia Vance left Asheville within 36 hours. There was no dramatic exit, no confrontation, no final words. She was simply there and then she was not, which was, Teresa later thought, the most honest thing about her. The absence of theater at the end was the one moment where Nadia had let her actual nature show through. She did not love drama. She loved money. The drama was always incidental to the money. When the money was gone, the drama went with it. The morning after the wedding that wasn't, Teresa went to find Preston. She had not slept. Daisy had slept perfectly, curled around Button with the deep, uncomplicated rest of a child who does not carry the weight of consequences, because she has not yet learned that consequences exist. Teresa had sat in the chair by the window of the staff cottage and waited for the light to come. She had rehearsed what she was going to say. She had prepared to be dismissed. She had prepared herself to understand that even if what she had done was right, what she had also done was bring chaos into this man's home and his life and his most vulnerable moment, and that not everyone could separate those 2 things cleanly. She found him on the terrace. He was standing at the railing, looking out at the Blue Ridge Mountains in the early morning light. He had a coffee cup in his hand. He looked like a man who also had not slept but who had used the wakefulness productively, the way certain people do, to arrive somewhere they had not been able to reach in daylight. He heard her step and turned. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I have been sitting here trying to figure out what I want to say to you." Teresa said, "Mr. Caldwell, I should have told you the moment I heard it, 6 weeks ago. I was afraid. That is not a good enough reason, and I am sorry." Preston was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You had Daisy to think about. You had this job to think about. You had an entire life that could have come apart if I hadn't believed you and Nadia had stayed." He set his coffee cup down on the railing. "I'm not angry with you, Teresa. I'm not angry," she said. "You should be, at least a little." He almost smiled. It was brief and it was tired, but it was there. "Maybe," he said, "but I'm more angry with myself. I think I knew something was wrong. I think I knew it for a while, and I didn't want to look at it." Teresa did not say anything. Some things don't need a response. They just need to be heard by someone who isn't going to run from them. They stood there for a while, the 2 of them, not saying anything, looking at the mountains the way people look at something very large and very still when they need to remember that the world extends beyond the particular wreckage of the immediate present. And then Preston said, "Where is Daisy?" Teresa said she was still asleep. He nodded. He said, "When she wakes up, will you tell her something from me?" Teresa said yes. He said, "Tell her I said thank you. And tell her Gerald's seat at the tea party is always open." Teresa walked back to the cottage and sat on the edge of Daisy's bed and watched her daughter sleep and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter and more durable than happiness. Safety. The specific safety of having done the true thing and come out the other side of it still standing. In the weeks that followed, the Caldwell estate returned to something like its normal rhythm, but not entirely the same normal. Small things were different. Preston had conversations with Teresa that he had not previously initiated. He asked her about Daisy's school options. He asked her about her goals, what she wanted, where she had been trying to get before life had rerouted her through here. She told him honestly. She had wanted to study interior design. She had started a program in Nashville before Daisy arrived, and then the program had stopped being financially feasible, and other things had taken priority, and somewhere in the logistics of surviving she had set it down, and not quite figured out how to pick it back up. Preston listened the way he had always listened, completely, with the specific quality of attention that made people feel that the thing they were saying mattered. And then he said, "There is a design firm in Asheville. One of the best in the Southeast. I have worked with them on 3 major properties. Their principal, a woman named Carla, started the same way you did, doing something else while the thing she actually wanted waited. She might be someone worth talking to." Teresa stared at him. He said, "If you want to, it's not a condition of anything. I'm not trying to run your life. I'm just saying the door exists." She called Carla 2 weeks later. Carla offered her a part-time apprenticeship that could be structured around Daisy's school schedule. The pay was less than the housekeeper position, but Preston had quietly, without announcement or ceremony, adjusted Teresa's housing arrangement to a long-term, no-cost lease on the staff cottage for as long as she needed it, which meant the math was different now. The math was possible. Teresa took the apprenticeship. She did not stop working at the estate entirely. She scaled back. She and Daisy stayed in the cottage. Daisy continued her tea parties in the kitchen, and Preston continued to appear in the doorway for them with the frequency of someone who has discovered a ritual that restores something in him and has no intention of giving it up. On a Thursday evening in late June, Teresa was in the kitchen making dinner when Preston appeared in the doorway and crouched down to Daisy's level and listened to a full dramatic retelling of that week's installment in the ongoing saga of Gerald the salt shaker, who had apparently developed a complicated friendship with a wooden spoon named Frank. And Teresa stood at the stove and listened to the sound of her daughter's voice filling the kitchen and thought about all the nights she had sat in the dark calculating the cost of every possible move and arriving at stillness because no move seemed safe enough. She thought about the night Daisy had walked onto a stage she was never supposed to be near. She thought about 6 words and what they had cost and what they had opened, and how the opening had turned out to be so much larger than the cost. She thought about the fact that a 4-year-old had done what she, Teresa, had spent 3 weeks being too afraid to do. And she thought about what it meant to raise a child who had not yet learned to be afraid of the truth. She decided she was going to try very hard to make sure Daisy never did. This story is not really about a wedding that didn't happen or a woman who ran schemes on lonely men, or even the security cameras that reviewed footage frame by frame trying to understand how it had all unraveled so fast. It is about the space that opens up when someone who has learned to be quiet decides, even accidentally, to say something. It is about the specific, irreplaceable courage of not having learned yet that you are supposed to be afraid. Daisy walked onto that stage because she saw someone she loved, and she knew something was wrong, and she said so. No calculation, no weighing of consequences, just the truth, delivered at full volume into a live microphone in front of 500 people by a child who was too young to know that the room was supposed to be too big for her. Most of us lose that somewhere. We learn about rooms that are too big for us. We learn about stakes that are too high for us. We learn about the cost of saying the true thing when the true thing is inconvenient to powerful people. We learn to be quiet, and sometimes being quiet is protection, and sometimes it is the thing that makes us complicit, and the hardest part is knowing the difference. Teresa spent 3 weeks not knowing the difference. Daisy never had to learn the difference at all. She just walked up to the microphone and spoke. May we all find a little of Daisy inside us, the part that doesn't add up what the truth is worth before saying it out loud, the part that just says it. There is a version of courage that looks like a warrior stepping forward in armor, and there is the version that looked like Daisy that night, barefoot, holding a rabbit named Button, saying 6 words into a microphone because she loved someone and knew something was wrong, and it simply did not occur to her to stay quiet about it. We spend so much of our lives calculating the risk of speaking. But the most powerful thing Teresa watched happen that April night was not the exposure of a scheme or the collapse of a performance that had been running for 8 months. It was a 4-year-old reminding 500 adults, and one very lonely man, and one woman who had been too afraid for too long, that the truth does not need armor. It just needs to be said. Teresa had known the truth for 3 weeks and had not been able to say it. Daisy knew it for about 30 seconds before she walked up to a microphone and delivered it to the whole room. The difference between them was not intelligence or love or even bravery in any technical sense. The difference was that Daisy had not yet been taught that the truth had a price, and in not knowing that, she paid nothing and changed everything. Hold onto whatever is left of that in you. Whatever piece of you has not yet fully learned to calculate before it speaks. That piece of you might be the most important thing you have. If this story reached something in you today, if it sat in your chest and stayed there the way the best stories do, please give it a like right now. It takes 1 second, it costs you nothing, and it genuinely helps this channel put stories like this one in front of people who need them. And if you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because every single week we bring you emotional true stories about real people, real moments, and the kind of courage that does not always look like courage from the outside. You do not want to miss what is coming. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me which moment in this story hit you the hardest. Was it Teresa standing frozen at that vent, knowing something enormous and having no idea what to do with it? Was it Daisy climbing those 3 steps onto a stage she was never supposed to be on, barefoot, holding button, and saying 6 words into a live microphone in front of 500 strangers? Or was it the morning after, Preston on the terrace with his coffee, looking out at the mountains and saying, "I think I knew something was wrong and I didn't want to look at it"? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to know which moment stayed with you. And before you go, I need to tell you this. There is a story coming to this channel very soon about a man who spent 14 years searching for someone he believed he had lost forever. He crossed state lines. He made phone calls that went nowhere. He never stopped looking. And the day he finally found them, that person had been standing 15 feet away from him the entire time. I have been sitting on this story for weeks because it is almost too much to carry. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss it the moment it drops. I will see you there.